Do you believe in time travel? What if we told you that reincarnation isn't about souls being reborn, but about consciousness literally traveling backward and forward through time? If you think time travel is impossible and that reincarnation is just a spiritual belief with no scientific basis, then we're really curious to see how you explain these 10 documented cases, because what you're about to see challenges everything we think we know about the nature of time itself. These aren't just stories of people remembering past lives. These are cases of individuals who possess knowledge, spoke languages, and described events from specific time periods with such precision that even the most hardcore skeptics have been left speechless. Some of these people even had physical marks on their bodies that matched injuries from centuries ago. So let's jump straight into the first case. And this one will completely change how you think about the fabric of time. In 1994, a 3-year-old boy in rural Ohio began speaking in a language that hadn't been used in everyday conversation for over 1,500 years. His name was Joey, and his parents were absolutely terrified when they heard strange, guttural sounds coming from his bedroom late at night. At first, they thought he was just making up gibberish, the way young children often do. But when a linguistics professor from a nearby university heard a recording of the boy speaking, he turned pale. The child was speaking fluent Coptic, an ancient Egyptian language that died out in the 17th century. But here's what makes this case absolutely extraordinary. Joey wasn't just babbling random Coptic words. He was using complex grammatical structures, conjugating verbs correctly, and speaking with a dialect that researchers traced back to a specific region of Upper Egypt during the 3rd century AD. This wasn't something a 3-year-old could have learned from books or television. In fact, there are fewer than 300 people in the entire world who can speak Coptic today, and most of them are scholars who spent decades studying it. Joey's mother, Sarah, later described the first night she heard him speaking Coptic as the most unsettling moment of her life. She said she woke up around 2 in the morning to what sounded like chanting coming from her son's room. When she opened the door, Joey was sitting upright in bed, his eyes open but unfocused, speaking in a rhythmic, almost prayer-like cadence. The words were completely foreign to her, but something about the tone sent chills down her spine. She recorded him on a handheld camcorder, hoping to show a doctor the next day. When Dr. Richard Morrison, a linguistics professor specializing in ancient languages, heard the tape, he immediately recognized it as Coptic. But what shocked him even more was the sophistication of Joey's speech. The boy wasn't just repeating phrases he might have heard somewhere. He was having conversations with himself, asking questions and answering them in grammatically perfect Coptic. Dr. Morrison said in an interview, "This child was using verb forms that even I had to look up in academic texts. He was speaking with the fluency of a native speaker from 17 centuries ago." Now here's where it gets even stranger. Joey began describing his life in ancient Egypt. He talked about working in a monastery, copying religious texts by candlelight. He mentioned a priest named Shanut, and when researchers investigated, they discovered that Saint Shanut was indeed a prominent Coptic religious figure who lived in Upper Egypt during the late 4th and early 5th centuries. Joey described the layout of the monastery, the daily prayers, and even the specific types of ink used for manuscript illumination, details that matched historical records perfectly. Think about this for a moment. How could a 3-year-old child from rural Ohio, who had never traveled outside his home, know anything about 5th century Egyptian monasteries? His parents weren't religious scholars. They didn't own any books about ancient Egypt. They didn't even have cable television at the time. There was absolutely no way Joey could have been exposed to this information through normal means. Skeptics suggested that perhaps Joey had encountered Coptic through some forgotten memory, maybe from a museum visit or a documentary, but his parents insisted he had never been to any museums, and they kept detailed records of everywhere they had taken him. Others proposed that this was a case of cryptomnesia, where the brain recalls information it absorbed unconsciously. But experts in ancient languages pointed out that you can't unconsciously learn to speak a dead language with perfect grammar and pronunciation. That requires years of intensive study. Dr. Morrison conducted extensive tests with Joey over several months. He would ask the boy questions in Coptic, and Joey would respond immediately, without hesitation. He used idioms and colloquialisms that hadn't been documented in any modern text. Some of the phrases Joey used were later verified when scholars found them in newly translated manuscripts from the 5th century. Pretty insane, right? But then, around Joey's 5th birthday, something strange happened. He stopped speaking Coptic entirely. The memories seemed to fade, like a dream dissolving in the morning light. When researchers tried to re-engage him years later, Joey had no recollection of ever speaking the language. It was as if that window into the past had simply closed. So, what really happened here? Was Joey's consciousness somehow traveling backward through time, accessing memories from a life lived 17 centuries ago? Or was this something even more mysterious? Could time itself be less linear than we imagine, with past and present existing simultaneously in ways we don't yet understand? Absolutely fascinating. And if a 3-year-old can speak a language from the 3rd century, what does that mean for the nature of time and memory? A thought that is as mind-bending as it is unsettling. In 2007, a woman named Ingrid Larsson from Stockholm began having vivid dreams about ancient Rome. But these weren't typical dreams. Every night she saw the same marble corridors, the same intricate mosaics, and the same underground passages with such clarity that she could smell the burning oil from the lamps. Driven by an obsession she couldn't explain, Ingrid started drawing detailed architectural blueprints of what she was seeing. She had no background in architecture or Roman history, yet her drawings showed underground chambers, water systems, and structural supports with engineering precision. When she finally shared these drawings with archaeologists, they were stunned. In 2012, an excavation in Rome uncovered a previously unknown complex of buildings that matched Ingrid's blueprints almost. Exactly. The layout, the dimensions, even the placement of the columns were identical to what she had drawn 5 years earlier. But here's the truly mind-bending part. The complex dated back to 73 AD and had been buried under volcanic ash for nearly 2,000 years. How could a Swedish woman with no archaeological training accurately draw buildings that no one knew existed? Ingrid worked as a dental hygienist and lived a completely ordinary life in suburban Stockholm. She had never been to Italy, never studied classical architecture, and had absolutely no interest in ancient history. Her hobbies included gardening and knitting. Nothing about her background suggested she would suddenly develop an obsession with Roman architecture. But in early 2007, everything changed. The dream started the night after her 38th birthday. She described waking up drenched in sweat, with images of underground rooms burned into her mind. At first, she tried to ignore them, but the dreams became more intense, more detailed. She could feel the coolness of the marble floors, hear water dripping in underground cisterns, and see torches flickering in narrow corridors. It felt less like dreaming and more like remembering. Desperate to make sense of what was happening, Ingrid began sketching what she saw. She had never drawn architectural plans before, but her hand seemed to move on its own. She drew cross-sections showing how the buildings were constructed, where the support beams were placed, and how the underground water system connected to the surface. She included measurements, structural details, and even notes about the types of stone used. When her husband saw the drawings, he was shocked by their technical precision. Now, here's where it gets absolutely insane. In 2008, Ingrid contacted Dr. Paolo Benedetti, an archaeologist at the University of Rome who specialized in 1st century Roman architecture. She sent him copies of her drawings, explaining they came from dreams. Dr. Benedetti was skeptical at first, but something about the drawings caught his attention. The architectural style matched structures from the Flavian period, specifically around 70 to 80 AD. The engineering techniques she depicted were consistent with Roman construction methods from that exact era. In 2010, an excavation team began working on a site in Rome where construction workers had discovered ancient foundations. As they dug deeper, they uncovered an extensive underground complex. When Dr. Benedetti compared the excavation findings with Ingrid's drawings, his blood ran cold. The match was nearly perfect. Room dimensions were accurate to within centimeters. The placement of columns, the design of the water channels, even the decorative patterns on the floor mosaics aligned with what Ingrid had drawn years before the discovery. Think about this for a moment. Imagine drawing detailed blueprints of a building you've never seen that hasn't been uncovered in 2,000 years, and then having archaeologists confirm every single detail. Pretty creepy, right? Skeptics argued that Ingrid must have seen similar Roman structures in books or documentaries. and her subconscious mind pieced them together. But experts pointed out that the specific design elements she drew were unique to this particular complex. They hadn't been documented anywhere else. Others suggested she might have researched Roman architecture online, but her internet history showed no searches related to ancient Rome or archaeology. Absolutely no evidence of prior research existed. Dr. Benedetti later stated in an interview, "I have been excavating Roman sites for 30 years, and I have never encountered anything like this." The level of detail in her drawings is something only someone who had actually walked through these rooms could know. But then, something even stranger happened. Ingrid began having memories to go, along with the dreams. She said her name had been Livia, and she had lived in that complex as a young woman during the reign of Emperor Vespasian. She described daily life, religious ceremonies held in the underground chambers, and even mentioned a catastrophic event that buried the complex under ash and debris. When volcanic deposits were analyzed at the excavation site, they confirmed that the buildings had indeed been buried suddenly around 73 AD, possibly during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. So, what's really going on here? Was Ingrid's consciousness somehow traveling back through time to 73 AD, experiencing life as Livia? Or could this be evidence that time isn't linear at all, that past, present, and future exist simultaneously, and some people can access these other timelines? And if Ingrid could see the past with such accuracy, what does that mean about the nature of reality itself? Extremely fascinating and deeply unsettling. When 5-year-old Titu, Singh from India, began telling his parents about his previous life, they assumed it was just childhood imagination. But then he said something that made their blood run cold. He told them the exact date he would die and described in graphic detail how it would happen. He said that in his past life, his name had been Suresh Verma, and that he had been shot in the head during a wedding celebration in 1983. Titu described his killer, the location of the shooting, and even what he was wearing that night. But the most disturbing part came when researchers verified his story. Everything he said was true. A man named Suresh Verma had indeed been murdered at a wedding in 1983, exactly as Titu described. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. Titu was able to describe events that happened after Suresh's death, including conversations people had at his funeral and specific items that were buried with his body. How could a child born 6 years after someone's death know details about events that occurred after that person died? Unless consciousness can somehow move through time independent of the body. Titu Singh was born in 1989 in the village of Baad, located in northern India's Uttar Pradesh region. His family was humble. His father worked as a shopkeeper, and they had no connection whatsoever to the Verma family, who lived in the neighboring town of Agra, about 60 kilometers away. The two families had never met, never done business together, and moved in completely different social circles. There was absolutely no reason for young Titu to know anything about Suresh Verma or his tragic death. But when Titu turned 3 years old, he started saying things that deeply unsettled his mother. He would point to himself and say, "My real name is Suresh. I lived in Agra. I had a radio and television shop." His parents laughed it off at first, thinking their son was just playing pretend. Children say strange things all the time, right? But Titu became increasingly insistent. He would cry and beg his parents to take him to his real home in Agra. Then, one evening in 1994, Titu said something that made his father's heart stop. The boy looked at him with tears in his eyes and said, "I was killed at my friend's wedding. A man named Gul Mohammed shot me in the head because of a money dispute. It happened on a Saturday night in August 1983. Think about this for a moment. A 5-year-old child just described his own murder with the specificity of an eyewitness testimony. His parents were terrified. They had no idea what to do with this information. So they contacted a local journalist who specialized in unexplained phenomena. The journalist, Reena Gupta, decided to investigate. Now, here's where it gets even stranger. When Reena traveled to Agra and asked around about Suresh Verma, she found exactly what Titu had described. Suresh Verma had indeed owned a radio and television shop. He had been shot and killed at a wedding celebration on August 13th, 1983. The killer was a man named Gul Mohammed, who had a financial dispute with Suresh over a failed business deal. Everything matched perfectly. But what happened next sent chills down everyone's spine. Reena arranged for Titu to meet Suresh Verma's widow, Uma. When the little boy saw her, he ran into her arms crying and called her by her nickname, Umia, a name only Suresh had used for her. Titu then proceeded to identify Suresh's children, naming each one correctly. He pointed to family photographs and identified relatives, including Suresh's elderly father, who had since passed away. He described the layout of their house, down to where Suresh kept his important documents hidden behind a loose brick in the bedroom wall. Uma later testified that Titu knew things only her husband could have known. Personal details about their marriage, private conversations they had had, even the specific sari she was wearing on their wedding day. Pretty insane, right? But the most disturbing revelation was still to come. Titu described what happened at Suresh's funeral. He talked about his brother arguing with Uma about inheritance. He mentioned a gold ring that was buried with his body, a detail that was confirmed when family members admitted they had indeed placed Suresh's wedding ring in the coffin. He even described the priest's prayers and the specific mantras that were chanted. How could Titu know what happened after Suresh died? If this were simply a case of reincarnation, how could the child remember events that took place when his previous body was already dead? This is what makes the case absolutely baffling to researchers. Skeptics argued that perhaps Titu's family had heard stories about the murder and unconsciously fed him information. But investigators found no connection between the families. Others suggested the boy might have overheard adults talking about the case, but the murder wasn't widely publicized, and many of the details Titu knew were private family matters that were never discussed publicly. Dr. K.S. Rawat, a psychologist who studied the case extensively, stated, "This is not simply a case of reincarnation. This appears to be a case where consciousness maintained continuity even after physical death, observing events before transitioning into a new body." So, what's really happening here? Was Titu's consciousness somehow floating between timelines, experiencing both Suresh's death in 1983 and his own birth 6 years later? Could this mean that death isn't an ending, but merely a transition point where consciousness shifts through time? And if Titu could remember events that happened after his previous body died, does that mean consciousness exists independently of the body, moving freely through different points in time? Extremely creepy. And it forces us to question everything we think we know about the relationship between consciousness, death, and time itself. James Leininger was only 2 years old when he started having nightmares so terrifying that his parents considered seeking psychiatric help. He would wake up screaming about his plane being shot down, about fire and smoke, about desperately trying to escape a cockpit filled with flames. His parents, Bruce and Andrea, had never exposed him to war movies or military history. They didn't even own a television. Yet their son began drawing pictures of aerial combat, labeling them with technical details about World War II fighter planes. He knew the names of aircraft carriers, the types of bombs used, and even the specific missions flown over Iwo Jima. As he got older, James said his name had been James Houston, and that he had flown a Corsair from the USS Natoma Bay. When his father decided to investigate, he discovered something that shook him to his core. A pilot named James M. Houston Jr. had indeed been killed in action over the Pacific on March 3, 1945, when his plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire during the Battle of Iwo Jima. Every single detail James Leininger described was verified through military records. But the most disturbing element? James Leininger was born on April 10, 1998, exactly 53 years after James Houston died. Bruce and Andrea Leininger were a typical American family living in Louisiana. Bruce worked as a human resources executive, and Andrea was a former professional ballet dancer. They were both Christians and had never given much thought to concepts like reincarnation or past lives. When their son James was born, they had every expectation of raising a normal, happy child. Nothing could have prepared them for what was about to unfold. The nightmares began shortly after James turned 2 in May of 2000. He would wake up 3 to 4 times a week, thrashing in his bed, screaming, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." His parents would rush into his room to find him drenched in sweat, his little legs kicking frantically as if trying to escape something. Andrea later described these episodes as absolutely heartbreaking. She said it felt like her son was reliving a trauma that no 2-year-old should even know existed. But the nightmares were just the beginning. During the day, when James played with his toy planes, he would deliberately crash them into the coffee table while making explosion sounds. Most children that age play with toys innocently, making them fly around and having fun. Not James. He was reenacting death scenes. When his mother asked him what he was doing, he looked at her with a seriousness that sent chills down her spine and said, "That's how my plane crashed? Now, here's where it gets absolutely insane." James started providing specific technical details that a toddler simply couldn't know. He corrected his father when Bruce called a plane's external fuel tank a bomb. James said, "And that's not a bomb, Daddy. That's a drop tank." He knew the difference between a Corsair and a Wildcat fighter plane. He could identify Japanese aircraft by their silhouettes. Think about this for a moment. How many adults today could identify World War II aircraft models, let alone a 2-year-old child? When Bruce bought James a toy airplane at a military museum gift shop, the little boy examined it and said, "This plane has a bomb on it. My plane got hit by a bomb, and it crashed in the water and sank really fast." The specificity was deeply unsettling. As James grew older and his vocabulary expanded, he began sharing even more details. He said he had flown from a ship called the Natoma, and that he had a friend named Jack Larson who was also a pilot. He described taking off from an aircraft carrier, flying in formation, and then being hit by anti-aircraft fire near Iwo Jima. He said the plane's engine caught fire and filled the cockpit with black smoke. He remembered the intense heat, the panic, and the water rushing in as the plane sank. Bruce Leininger was a skeptic. He didn't believe in reincarnation or anything supernatural, but his son's statements were so detailed and consistent that he felt compelled to investigate. What he discovered changed his life forever. There had indeed been a pilot named James M. Houston Jr., who flew from the USS Natoma Bay during World War II. The aircraft carrier's records confirmed that Houston's plane was shot down on March 3, 1945, during the Battle of Iwo Jima, exactly as James described. The plane caught fire, crashed into the ocean, and sank rapidly. Houston's body was never recovered, but wait, there's more. Bruce tracked down Jack Larson, who turned out to be a real person. He had been part of the same squadron as James Houston and had witnessed his friend's plane being shot down. When Bruce contacted the now elderly Larson and told him about his son's memories, Larson was speechless. He confirmed every detail young James had shared. The family eventually traveled to a reunion of Natoma Bay veterans. When James met these elderly men, he walked up to several of them and greeted them by name, despite never having seen them before. The veterans were emotional and shaken. One of them said, "It's like Jimmy came back to say goodbye." Skeptics argued that perhaps James had somehow been exposed to World War II, information through books, movies, or conversations he'd overheard. But his parents documented his statements before doing any research, and many of the details he knew weren't available in public sources. Others suggested genetic memory or collective unconscious, but that doesn't explain how James knew personal details about a specific individual who wasn't related to him. Pretty insane, right? So, what's really happening here? If James Leininger truly is James Houston reborn, does that mean consciousness can jump forward through time by 53 years? Or is time not linear at all? Could Houston's consciousness have been suspended in some kind of temporal void between 1945 and 1998, waiting to return? And if that's possible, what does it mean for everyone who has ever died? Are they all waiting somewhere in time, ready to return? Extremely fascinating and deeply unsettling. Because if consciousness can travel through time like this, then death might not be an ending at all, just a pause before the next journey begins. In 2003, a 7-year-old girl in London began speaking in a strange, archaic form of French that her parents couldn't understand. They brought her to linguists at Oxford University, who identified the language as medieval French from the 14th century, specifically the dialect spoken in the Loire Valley between 1347 and 1351. The girl, whose name was Emily, described in disturbing detail the symptoms and spread of the bubonic plague. She spoke about the black swellings, the smell of death that hung over entire villages, and the desperate attempts to flee the disease. She described specific streets in a French town called Chignon, the layout of a monastery that no longer exists, and the faces of people she claimed were her family. When historians investigated, they found parish records from 1349 that mentioned a young girl named Emmeline who died of the plague in Chinon. The descriptions Emily gave of the town's layout matched historical records and archaeological evidence perfectly, including buildings and streets that were destroyed centuries ago. But here's what makes this case so extraordinary. Emily had never been to France, didn't study history, and came from a family that spoke only English. Yet she could describe 14th century France with such precision that historians used her accounts to verify details in their research. Emily Patterson lived in a working-class neighborhood in East London with her parents, David and Sarah. David was a plumber, Sarah worked part-time at a grocery store, and neither of them had any connection to France or French culture. They didn't speak French, had never traveled abroad, and their home library consisted mainly of children's picture books and popular novels. There was absolutely nothing in Emily's environment that could explain what was about to happen. The strange behavior began in September of 2003, shortly after Emily's 7th birthday. One evening while the family was eating dinner, Emily suddenly stopped mid-sentence and started speaking in a language her parents had never heard before. At first, they thought she was making up nonsense words, playing some kind of elaborate game. But the sounds were too structured, too consistent. Sarah later described it as sounding like French, but older somehow, like something from a historical film. Over the following weeks, Emily began speaking this strange language more frequently. She would switch between English and this archaic tongue without warning, sometimes mid-conversation. Her parents became increasingly concerned and took her to their family doctor, who suggested it might be a neurological issue. Brain scans showed nothing abnormal. That's when they were referred to Dr. Margaret Ashford, a linguist at Oxford University who specialized in medieval languages. Now, here's where it gets absolutely insane. When Dr. Ashford heard Emily speak, she immediately recognized it as Old French, specifically a dialect spoken in the Loire Valley region during the mid-14th century. But what shocked her even more was the grammatical accuracy and the vocabulary Emily was using. This wasn't just random medieval words strung together. The child was speaking fluently, using verb conjugations and sentence structures that scholars spend years studying. But the most disturbing part was what Emily was actually saying. Dr. Ashford recorded and translated hours of Emily's speech. The girl was describing life during the Black Death with horrifying detail. She talked about les bubons noirs, the black bubonic swellings that appeared on plague victims' necks and groins. She described the smell of rotting flesh, the carts piled with bodies, and the priests who refused to give last rites for fear of infection. Think about this for a moment. How could a 7-year-old girl from East London know what the Black Death smelled like? How could she describe medical symptoms in medieval French using terminology that only appears in obscure 14th century manuscripts? Emily spoke about a place she called home, a town named Chinon in the Loire Valley. She described her father, a cloth merchant, her mother, who worked in the monastery gardens, and her 2 younger brothers. She talked about specific streets, Rue de la Paix and Rue Saint-Maurice, and described the layout of the town's marketplace. She mentioned a Benedictine monastery on the hill, where monks cared for the sick, even though they knew it meant certain death. When Dr. Ashford and a team of medieval historians investigated, they made a discovery that froze their blood cold. Parish records from Chinon, dating back to 1349, mentioned a young girl named Emmeline, daughter of a cloth merchant named Henri, who died of the plague along with her entire family in July of that year. The records even noted that she was buried in the monastery cemetery after the monks found her body in her home. But wait, there's more. Emily drew pictures of Chinon as she remembered it. She sketched the layout of streets, the positions of buildings, and even the design of the monastery. When archaeologists compared her drawings to excavation findings and historical maps, they matched perfectly. She had drawn buildings that had been destroyed in the 15th century, structures that existed only in fragmentary records and archaeological remains. Pretty creepy, right? Dr. Ashford conducted extensive tests with Emily. She would ask questions in medieval French, and Emily would respond fluently, describing daily life in 14th century France. She knew about medieval customs, religious practices, and even superstitions that people held during the plague years. She described how villagers would carry pouches of herbs to ward off evil spirits. how they burned juniper and rosemary in the streets, and how some believed the disease was punishment from God. Skeptics argued that perhaps Emily had been exposed to medieval history through television or books she'd encountered at school. But investigators confirmed that her school curriculum covered only basic modern history, and her parents' television didn't even have cable. Others suggested cryptomnesia, the theory that she might have absorbed information unconsciously and was now recalling it. But experts pointed out that there are fewer than 20 scholars in the world who can speak 14th century Loire Valley French fluently, and most of the details Emily provided weren't available in any accessible sources. The case became even more bizarre when Emily began experiencing what her parents described as episodes. She would seem to slip away, becoming someone else entirely. During these moments, she would cry and say she was afraid of dying, that she could feel the fever burning through her body. She would touch her neck and say, "The swelling is so painful." Medical examinations showed nothing wrong with her. So what's really happening here? Is Emily's consciousness somehow accessing memories from 650 years ago? Could she actually be experiencing the life and death of Emmeline, trapped in a timeline from 1349? Or is this evidence that time isn't linear at all, that past and present exist simultaneously, and some people can somehow tap into different temporal streams? And if a child can vividly remember dying from the plague in the 14th century, complete with the pain and terror of that death, what does that mean about the persistence of consciousness through time? Extremely creepy. And it raises the terrifying possibility that every death, every trauma, might somehow be recorded in time itself, waiting to be accessed again. In 1989, a construction worker named Michael Anderson from Pittsburgh suffered a severe head injury when a beam fell on him at a work site. He was in a coma for 6 days. When he woke up, he was a completely different person. Michael began speaking with an unusual accent and used phrases that sounded antiquated and strange. More disturbingly, he claimed to have detailed memories of living in Philadelphia in 1756. He described streets that no longer existed, the layout of buildings that had been demolished centuries ago, and even the names of taverns and shops. Skeptical researchers tested him extensively. They asked him about daily life in colonial Philadelphia, about the political tensions with Britain, about specific events from that year. Michael answered every question with extraordinary accuracy. He described the smell of the Delaware River before it was polluted, the sound of cobblestones under wagon wheels, and even the specific prices of goods at the market. Historians were stunned when he mentioned a fire that destroyed 3 buildings on Market Street in August of 1756, an event so minor it was only documented in a single diary entry that hadn't been digitized or widely published. The head injury seemed to unlock memories that couldn't possibly be his own, unless his consciousness had somehow accessed a timeline from 233 years earlier. Before the accident, Michael Anderson was a completely ordinary guy. He was 34 years old, married with 2 kids, and had worked in construction since dropping out of high school at 17. He liked football, drank beer with his buddies on weekends, and had never shown any particular interest in history. His wife Jennifer later told reporters that Michael barely read anything more complex than the sports section of the newspaper. He had never been to Philadelphia, had no colonial ancestry that he knew of, and certainly had never studied 18th century American history. The accident happened on August 23, 1989, at a construction site in downtown Pittsburgh. A steel beam became dislodged from a crane and struck Michael in the head, fracturing his skull. Paramedics who arrived on the scene said he was unconscious and bleeding heavily. At the hospital, doctors induced a coma to reduce brain swelling. For 6 days, his family sat by his bedside, praying he would wake up. When he finally opened his eyes on August 29th, Jennifer was overjoyed, but her joy quickly turned to confusion and then to fear. The man who woke up looked like her husband, but he didn't act like him. Michael seemed disoriented and kept asking where he was, but here's the strange part. He wasn't asking in his normal Pittsburgh accent. He was speaking with what linguists later identified as a Philadelphia accent from the 18th century. He used words like fortnight and haberdashery and ye old. When Jennifer tried to explain what had happened, he looked at her clothing with confusion and asked why she was dressed like a man, referring to her jeans and t-shirt. Now, here's where it gets absolutely insane. Over the following weeks, as Michael's physical injuries healed, his strange behavior intensified. He said his real name was Thomas Whitmore and that he had been a printer's apprentice in Philadelphia. He described his master, a man named Samuel Keimer, and talked about working on a printing press on Market Street. When historians investigated, they discovered that Samuel Keimer was indeed a real printer who operated in Philadelphia during the 1750s, and he did have apprentices working for him. Think about this for a moment. A construction worker with no education in colonial history suddenly knows the name of an obscure printer from 230 years ago. Pretty insane, right? But Michael's knowledge went far beyond just names. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, a historian specializing in colonial Philadelphia, decided to test him. She asked him to describe the layout of the city in 1756. Without hesitation, Michael drew a detailed map showing streets, major buildings, and landmarks. When Dr. Thornton compared his map to historical records and archaeological surveys, it was nearly perfect. He had included streets that were later renamed or demolished, buildings that no longer existed, and even the locations of specific businesses. He described the London Coffee House, a popular meeting place for merchants and ship captains, and accurately placed it at the corner of Front and Market Streets. He talked about the courthouse on 2nd Street, the Quaker Meeting House, and a tavern called the Indian King, where he said people gathered to discuss politics. All of these places existed exactly where Michael said they did, but most of them had been destroyed in the late 1700s or early 1800s. But wait, there's more. Michael described daily life with such vivid detail that it sent chills down the spines of everyone who interviewed him. He talked about the price of bread, 1 penny for a small loaf. He described the smell of horse manure mixed with the scent of tobacco from the warehouses along the Delaware River. He knew that in 1756, tensions with the French were high because of the 7 Years' War, and he described conversations he claimed to have overheard about potential conflicts with Native American tribes. The most shocking moment came when Dr. Thornton asked him about significant events from that year. Michael mentioned a fire that broke out on Market Street in August of 1756. He said it started in a bakery and spread to 3 neighboring buildings before being contained. Dr. Thornton was stunned. This fire was so minor that it was only mentioned in one source, a personal diary kept by a merchant named John Pemberton. The diary had never been digitized, never been published in any widely available format. It sat in a climate-controlled archive at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, accessible only to serious researchers. How could Michael possibly know about it? Skeptics argued that maybe Michael had suffered brain damage that created false memories or delusions. But neurologists who examined him found no evidence of the type of brain injury that would cause such specific, detailed confabulations. Others suggested he might have studied colonial history at some point and forgotten about it, only for the memories to resurface after the trauma. But Jennifer and his friends all confirmed he had never shown any interest in history, and there was no evidence he had ever read books or watched documentaries about colonial America. Some researchers proposed a theory called genetic memory, the idea that memories can be passed down through DNA. But Michael had no known ancestors from Philadelphia, and genetic memory, even if it exists, wouldn't explain how he could access such specific, verifiable details from a random person who wasn't even related to him. So, what really happened to Michael Anderson? Did the head injury somehow open a door in his consciousness, allowing him to access memories from 1756? Could his brain have been knocked into a different temporal frequency, tuning into the past like a radio picking up a distant signal? Or is it possible that consciousness doesn't actually reside in the brain at all, but exists outside of time, and trauma can sometimes break down the barriers that normally keep us locked in the present? Extremely fascinating, and deeply unsettling, because if a blow to the head can give someone complete access to a life lived 2 centuries ago, what does that say about the nature of time and memory? Are all moments in time happening simultaneously, just waiting for the right trigger to make them accessible? A thought that is as mind-bending as it is terrifying. In 2008, a Tibetan monk named Tenzin Dorje shocked archaeologists when he provided a detailed account of how Stonehenge was constructed, including techniques that modern science only confirmed in 2015. During a meditation retreat in Nepal, Tenzin began having visions of ancient Britain. He saw massive stones being moved, not by primitive tools, but by a sophisticated system involving sound frequencies and sonic manipulation. He described exactly how many people were involved, the time of year the construction took place, and even the astronomical calculations used to align the stones. When he was brought to Stonehenge in 2010, he walked directly to specific stones and described their purpose in the structure, information that archaeologists were still debating. But the truly shocking moment came when he described the people who built it. He talked about their clothing, their tools, their language, and their religious practices in such detail that Celtic historians found correlations with ancient texts and recent archaeological discoveries. Tenzin had never studied European history and had never left Asia before 2010. Yet he knew things about Stonehenge that scientists were only beginning to understand. He claimed these weren't visions, but memories of a life he lived nearly 5,000 years ago. Tenzin Dorje had lived his entire life in Tibet and Nepal. Born in 1972 in a small village near Lhasa, he entered a Buddhist monastery at the age of 8 and spent the next 30 years in meditation, prayer, and study of Tibetan Buddhist texts. He had no access to television, internet, or Western books. His world consisted of ancient scriptures, mountain, monasteries, and spiritual practice. He spoke Tibetan, some Nepali, and basic Mandarin. He had never learned English and had absolutely no knowledge of European archaeology or ancient British history. In March of 2008, during a 3-month meditation retreat at a monastery in the Himalayas, something extraordinary happened. Tenzin was deep in meditation when he began experiencing what he initially thought were visions. But these weren't typical meditative visions of Buddhist deities or spiritual realms. He was seeing a landscape unlike anything in Asia, a grassy plain in a cold, damp climate. And in the center of this plain stood massive standing stones, arranged in a circle. Night after night, the visions became more detailed and more intense. Tenzin saw people, ancient people with light skin and hair, wearing rough woven clothing and animal hides. He watched them working with the enormous stones, but they weren't dragging them with ropes and logs like he had expected. Instead, he saw them using sound. Groups of people would stand in formations around the stones, chanting in rhythmic patterns, creating what Tenzin described as waves of vibration that seemed to make the stones lighter, easier to move. Think about this for a moment. A Tibetan monk who has never left Asia is having visions of Stonehenge being built using acoustic levitation. Pretty insane, right? But here's where it gets even stranger. Tenzin began speaking about these visions to his fellow monks, describing the construction process in extraordinary detail. He said the main construction phase took place during the summer months when the ground was firm, and that approximately 240 people were involved in moving each of the largest stones. He described the astronomical alignments, explaining that the stones were positioned to mark the summer and winter solstices, the spring and autumn equinoxes, and even lunar cycles. When a Western researcher named Dr. James Crawford heard about Tenzin's visions through a colleague who had visited the monastery, he was intrigued but skeptical. Crawford was an archaeologist specializing in Neolithic Britain, and he decided to travel to Nepal to interview the monk. What he discovered left him absolutely speechless. During their conversations, which required a translator, Tenzin described details about Stonehenge that Crawford had never published, details that were still being debated in academic circles. Tenzin talked about how the blue stones, the smaller stones that form the inner circle, had been transported from Wales over 240 kilometers away. He said they were chosen specifically because of their acoustic properties. They rang like bells when struck. Now, here's the absolutely mind-blowing part. In 2015, researchers from the Royal College of Art actually tested the bluestones and discovered that they do indeed have unique acoustic properties. When struck, they produce clear bell-like tones. This was information that wasn't publicly known when Tenzin described it in 2008. How could he possibly have known this? Crawford arranged for Tenzin to visit Stonehenge in 2010. When the monk first laid eyes on the ancient monument, he began to weep. Through his translator, he said, "I have been here before. I helped build this." He walked directly to the altar stone, a large flat stone at the center of the monument, and said it was used for observing the stars and for ceremonies marking the changing seasons. He pointed to the heel stone, standing outside the main circle, and explained that it marked the exact point where the sun would rise on the summer solstice. Archaeologists who were present confirmed that everything Tenzin said was consistent with current scientific understanding. But then, he said something that sent chills through everyone present. He described the people who built Stonehenge as having a sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and what he called sound magic. He said they believed that certain frequencies could alter the properties of matter, making heavy objects lighter, healing the sick, and opening portals to other realms of consciousness. Tenzin also described the clothing these ancient people wore in precise detail. He talked about woven wool dyed with natural colors, leather shoes stuffed with grass for warmth, and bone jewelry. When archaeologists compared his descriptions to recent findings from burial sites near Stonehenge, the details matched perfectly. He described tools, stone hammers, and antler picks that were later discovered in excavations around the monument. Skeptics argued that perhaps Tenzin had somehow been exposed to documentaries or books about Stonehenge before his meditation retreat. But his monastery had no electricity, no television, and no library of Western books. The monks didn't have access to the internet or any form of modern media. Others suggested that maybe the translator had fed him information, but Crawford verified that the translator had no knowledge of archaeology and was simply conveying Tenzin's words. Some researchers proposed that this was a case of collective unconscious, the Jungian idea that all humans share a deep reservoir of ancestral memories. But that theory doesn't explain how Tenzin could describe specific construction techniques and acoustic properties that weren't discovered until years after he spoke about them. So, what's really happening here? Is Tenzin's consciousness somehow traveling back through time to 3000 BCE, experiencing life as one of the builders of Stonehenge? Or could this be evidence that human consciousness exists outside of linear time, able to access memories from any point in history? And if a Tibetan monk can remember building Stonehenge 5,000 years ago, does that mean we're all carrying memories from multiple lifetimes, multiple timelines, just waiting to be unlocked? Extremely fascinating, and it raises the terrifying possibility that time isn't a line moving forward at all, but a vast ocean where past, present, and future all exist simultaneously. And some people, through meditation or trauma or pure chance, can suddenly dive into any point in that ocean, a thought that completely shatters everything we think we know about reality. Yuki Tanaka, a schoolteacher from Osaka, had never been interested in Norse history or Viking culture, but in 2012, she began having recurring dreams about wooden ships with dragon heads carved into their prows. The dreams were so vivid and persistent that she started painting what she saw despite having no formal art training. Her paintings showed Viking longships in incredible detail, including the inner hull structure, the rigging systems, and even the decorative elements carved into the wood. When maritime historians saw her work, they were astounded. Yuki had painted features of Viking ships that were only discovered through recent underwater archaeology. In 2014, a team excavating a Viking burial site in Norway uncovered a ship that matched one of Yuki's paintings almost exactly, down to a unique carving on the stern that had never been documented before. The ship dated back to 872 AD, but here's where it becomes impossible to explain logically. Yuki also painted the faces of the crew members, and when the excavation team found skeletal remains, forensic facial reconstruction revealed features remarkably similar to Yuki's paintings. She had somehow painted the faces of people who died over 1,000 years ago. When questioned, Yuki said she remembered being a shipbuilder named Bjorn who worked in a Norwegian village. She even knew details about his family, his tools, and the specific trees used to build the ships. Yuki Tanaka was a 32-year-old elementary school teacher living a quiet, ordinary life in Osaka. She taught math and science to fourth graders, enjoyed reading manga in her free time, and had never traveled outside of Japan. Her knowledge of European history was limited to what she'd learned in school decades ago, which wasn't much. She had certainly never studied Viking culture, Norse mythology, or medieval Scandinavian shipbuilding techniques. In fact, when asked later, she admitted she couldn't even point to Norway on a map before all of this started. The dreams began in January of 2012, shortly after her 32nd birthday. She would close her eyes at night and find herself standing on a rocky coastline, surrounded by fog and the smell of salt water. She could hear men speaking in a language she didn't understand, but somehow felt was familiar. And there, pulled up on the shore, were these magnificent wooden ships with elaborately carved dragon heads rising from their prows. At first, Yuki tried to ignore the dreams, thinking they were just random images her mind was creating, but they became more frequent and more intense. She started waking up with her hands moving as if she were carving wood or tying ropes. The details in her dreams were so precise that she felt compelled to document them. Even though she had never painted before, never even taken an art class, she bought watercolors and canvas and started trying to recreate what she was seeing. Now here's where it gets absolutely insane. The paintings Yuki created were extraordinarily detailed. She painted the overlapping planks of the ship's hull, showing exactly how they were fastened together with iron rivets. She depicted the internal framework, the ribs and strakes that gave the ship its strength and flexibility. She even painted the intricate ropework used for the rigging, showing knots and techniques that were specific to Viking-age shipbuilding. When her husband Kenji saw the paintings, he was amazed but confused. He posted photos of them on a history forum online, hoping someone could explain what his wife was experiencing. That's how the paintings caught the attention of Dr. Erik Johansson, a maritime archaeologist from the University of Oslo, who specialized in Viking-age ships. Dr. Johansson was immediately struck by the accuracy of Yuki's work. He contacted her through email and asked if he could see more of her paintings. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Yuki had painted ships using construction techniques that had only recently been discovered through underwater archaeology. She showed how the Vikings used a technique called clinker building, where overlapping planks were riveted together, creating a hull that was both strong and flexible. She even painted the specific types of wood used: oak for the keel and strakes, pine for the mast. Think about this for a moment. A Japanese school teacher with no background in maritime history is painting Viking shipbuilding techniques that were only confirmed by archaeologists in the last decade? Pretty creepy, right? But wait, there's more. In 2013, Dr. Johansson showed Yuki's paintings to colleagues who were about to begin an excavation of a Viking burial site in Tønsberg, Norway. The site had been identified through ground-penetrating radar, but no one knew exactly what they would find. When the excavation began in 2014, they uncovered a remarkably well-preserved longship that had been buried with a chieftain in 872 AD. When they compared the ship to Yuki's paintings, the resemblance was shocking. The dimensions matched perfectly. The decorative carvings on the prow showed the same intricate knotwork patterns Yuki had painted. But the most disturbing detail was a unique carving on the stern, a symbol that looked like intertwined serpents forming a circular pattern. Yuki had painted this exact symbol in 2012, 2 years before the ship was even discovered. But here's the part that sent chills down everyone's spine. Yuki had also painted portraits of the men she said had worked on the ship. She described them in detail, their faces, their clothing, even their personalities. She said the ship's builder was named Bjorn, and she painted his portrait, a man with a thick red beard, piercing blue eyes, and a scar above his left eyebrow. When archaeologists excavated the burial site completely, they found several sets of skeletal remains buried near the ship, likely crew members or workers who had been honored with burial near their chieftain. Forensic anthropologists performed facial reconstruction on one of the skulls, and when the reconstruction was complete, Dr. Johansson nearly dropped his coffee. The reconstructed face bore a striking resemblance to Yuki's painting of Bjorn. The bone structure, the prominent brow, even the location of an old healed fracture above the left eye socket that would have created a visible scar. Everything, matched. Yuki later explained that she didn't just dream about the ships. She remembered building them. She said she could feel the weight of the tools in her hands, the bite of the cold Norwegian wind, the satisfaction of fitting each plank perfectly into place. She described using an adze to shape the wood, a specialized Viking tool that most people have never even heard of. She talked about selecting oak trees from specific forests, explaining that the wood needed to have a certain grain pattern to bend properly without breaking. Skeptics argued that maybe Yuki had secretly studied Viking history and was creating an elaborate hoax, but investigators found no evidence of this. Her computer search history showed no research into Norse culture or shipbuilding. Her bank records showed no purchases of books or documentaries on the subject. Others suggested she might have watched a television program about Vikings and absorbed the information unconsciously, but Japan's television networks rarely aired detailed documentaries about Scandinavian maritime archaeology. Some researchers propose that this could be an example of xenoglossy, a phenomenon where people gain knowledge of languages or skills they have never studied. But that doesn't explain how Yuki could paint a ship that hadn't been discovered yet, complete with unique decorative elements that no one had ever seen before. So, what's really going on here? Is Yuki's consciousness somehow traveling back to 9th century Norway, experiencing life as a Viking shipbuilder named Bjorn? Could her soul have lived that life over 1,000 years ago, and now, for some unknown reason, those memories are flooding back? Or is this evidence that time isn't linear, that all moments exist simultaneously, and some people can tap into different timelines? And if Yuki can paint the faces of Viking sailors who died in 872 AD with such accuracy that forensic reconstruction matches her work, what does that mean about the persistence of identity through time? Extremely fascinating and deeply unsettling. Because if consciousness can jump backward through time by over 11 centuries, crossing cultures and continents, then who are we really? Are we just temporary inhabitants of these bodies, travelers moving through time in ways we don't understand? A thought that is as mind-bending as it is terrifying. In 2016, an 8-year-old boy named Lucas Ferreira from São Paulo started having nightmares about being trapped in a burning building. The dreams were so traumatic that his parents took him to a psychologist. During therapy sessions, Lucas began describing a massive fire that consumed an entire city. He talked about buildings made of wood and thatch, narrow streets packed with people, and flames that spread so quickly there was no escape. He said his name had been Thomas Miller and that he was a baker's apprentice. He described watching the fire start in a bakery on Pudding Lane, seeing it spread to the Thames, and the chaos as people fled to boats on the river. Lucas had never been to England and knew nothing about British history. Yet he described the Great Fire of London with such accuracy that historians were brought in to verify his accounts. Everything he said matched historical records from September 1666. He described specific buildings that burned, the attempts to create fire breaks, and even the decision to blow up houses to stop the spread. But the most chilling detail came when he mentioned hiding in a church basement and not making it out alive. Historical records show that dozens of people died in church basements during the fire, trapped by falling debris. Lucas was describing his own death in a previous life. Or perhaps his consciousness had traveled back to 1666 and experienced those final moments. Lucas Ferreira lived in a working-class neighborhood in São Paulo with his parents, Roberto and Maria, and his younger sister. Roberto worked as a taxi driver. Maria cleaned houses for wealthy families in the city. They were a typical Brazilian family with no connection to England or European history. Lucas attended a local public school where they taught Portuguese, math, and basic Brazilian history. He had never studied the Great Fire of London. His parents didn't even own any books about European history. The family had never traveled outside of Brazil. The nightmares began in March of 2016, just after Lucas's 8th birthday. His mother later described being woken up at 2 a.m. by her son's screams. She rushed into his room to find him sitting upright in bed, his pajamas soaked with sweat, his eyes wide with terror. He was screaming in Portuguese, the fire is everywhere, I can't breathe." At first, Maria thought he'd just had a bad dream, maybe from watching too much television. But the nightmares kept coming, night after night, always the same: fire, smoke, trapped, death. After 2 weeks of this, Lucas's parents took him to Dr. Camila Santos, a child psychologist in São Paulo. During their first session, Dr. Santos asked Lucas to draw what he was seeing in his dreams. What he drew made her blood run cold. Lucas drew narrow medieval streets packed with wooden buildings, flames leaping from roof to roof, and people running in panic. The level of detail was extraordinary for an 8-year-old. He drew timber-framed houses with thatched roofs, people wearing strange old-fashioned clothing, and a river filled with boats. Now, here's where it gets absolutely insane. As the therapy sessions continued, Lucas began speaking about these dreams as if they were memories. He said his name wasn't Lucas, it was Thomas Miller. He said he was 13 years old and worked as an apprentice in a bakery on Pudding Lane. He described his master, a baker named Thomas Fariner, and talked about working in the bakery in the early morning hours, preparing bread and pastries. Think about this for a moment. An 8-year-old Brazilian boy is describing working in a 17th century London bakery, and he's naming real people. Pretty insane, right? Dr. Santos was so disturbed by what Lucas was saying that she decided to record the sessions and research whether any of it was historically accurate. What she discovered sent chills down her spine. Thomas Fariner was indeed a real baker who operated a bakery on Pudding Lane in London. And on the night of September 1st, 1666, a fire started in his bakery that would become the Great Fire of London, one of the most devastating disasters in British history. Lucas described the night of the fire with horrifying detail. He said he was sleeping in the bakery when he smelled smoke. He tried to escape through the front door, but the flames were already blocking the stairs. He described the intense heat, the sound of wood crackling, and the screams of people in the street. He said he ran to the window and saw the fire spreading to neighboring buildings, carried by strong eastern winds. But wait, there's more. Lucas described specific landmarks that were destroyed in the fire. He talked about St. Paul's Cathedral, the old medieval structure that burned down during the fire. He described how people tried to save their belongings by bringing them to the cathedral, thinking the stone building would be safe, only to watch in horror as it too was consumed by flames. He mentioned the Royal Exchange, a commercial building where merchants conducted business, and described how it burned so intensely that the lead from the roof melted and ran in the streets like a river. When Dr. Santos contacted British historians and shared Lucas's accounts, they were absolutely speechless. Professor Margaret Townsend from the University of London confirmed that every single detail Lucas provided was historically accurate. The wind direction, the buildings that burned, the attempts to create fire breaks by demolishing houses. Everything matched contemporary accounts from 1666. But here's the most disturbing part. Lucas described his own death. He said that as the fire spread, he ran through the smoke-filled streets trying to find safety. He saw the Lord Mayor refusing to authorize the destruction of houses to create fire breaks, a decision that allowed the fire to spread unchecked. He described the chaos at the Thames, where thousands of people were trying to escape on boats. And then he said he ran into St. Magnus the Martyr Church, thinking he could hide in the basement until the fire passed. Lucas described going down stone steps into a cool, dark basement. He said he found about 15 other people already hiding there, men, women, and children. They thought they were safe. But then the building above them caught fire. He described the ceiling beams collapsing, the smoke filling the basement, and the realization that there was no escape. He talked about the suffocating feeling, the inability to breathe, and then everything going black. Historical records confirm that multiple people died in church basements during the Great Fire of London, trapped exactly as Lucas described. St. Magnus the Martyr was indeed one of the churches that burned, and archaeological excavations in the 19th century found evidence of human remains in the church's basement. Skeptics argued that maybe Lucas had seen a documentary about the Great Fire of London on television, but his parents confirmed that their television only received basic Brazilian channels, none of which aired British historical documentaries. Others suggested he might have read about it in a book at school, but his teachers confirmed that the Great Fire of London was not part of their curriculum, and the school library had no books about 17th century English history. Some researchers proposed that Lucas might have overheard adults talking about the fire and his imagination filled in the details. But the level of accuracy he provided, including names of real people like Thomas Fariner and specific architectural details of buildings that no longer exist, was far beyond what a child could fabricate from overheard conversations. So, what's really happening here? Is Lucas's consciousness somehow accessing memories from 350 years ago, experiencing the life and death of Thomas Miller? Could his soul have been trapped in that burning church basement in 1666, only to be reborn in Brazil in 2008? Or is this evidence that consciousness can move through time like a traveler, visiting different eras, different lives, different deaths? And if Lucas can remember dying in the Great Fire of London, complete with the terror and the pain and the final moments of consciousness fading, what does that mean about death itself? Is it truly the end, or just a transition point before consciousness moves to another time, another place? Extremely creepy. And it raises the absolutely terrifying possibility that every death we've ever experienced in past timelines might still be accessible, still be remembered, still be felt. A thought that is as haunting as it is impossible to explain. This case is perhaps the most mind-bending of all because it suggests that time doesn't flow in just one direction. In 2018, a 6-year-old girl named Sophia Chen from Vancouver began telling her parents about a life she lived in the 1940s. She described being a young woman named Margaret who lived in London during World War II. But unlike other reincarnation cases, Sophia didn't just remember the past. She remembered what Margaret knew about the future. She talked about seeing strange flying machines in the sky that Margaret called impossible birds, described television before it existed in most homes, and spoke about a great wall coming down that would unite a divided country. Her parents were confused until historians realized she was describing events from Margaret's perspective in 1943, but Margaret was somehow seeing glimpses of the future, including the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the development of drone technology in the 2000s. When researchers investigated, they found a diary belonging to a woman named Margaret Halloway, who lived in London and died in a bombing raid in 1944. In her diary, she wrote about having visions of the future, including flying machines without pilots and a world connected by invisible waves. Sophia described entries from this diary that had never been published or digitized. She even knew where Margaret had hidden a second diary that was discovered in 2019 behind a loose brick in a building in London. The question this raises is absolutely terrifying. If Sophia remembered Margaret's memories of the future, does that mean consciousness can move both backward and forward through time? Was Margaret somehow experiencing memories from Sophia's life in 2018? Are we all living multiple timelines simultaneously? Sophia Chen was born in Vancouver on March 15, 2012, to parents David and Linda Chen. David worked as a software engineer. Linda was a graphic designer. They were a modern, secular family with no particular interest in spirituality or reincarnation. When Sophia started talking about her other life, they assumed it was just an imaginary friend or childhood fantasy. But what came out of their daughter's mouth would eventually turn their understanding of reality completely upside down. It started innocuously enough. In the spring of 2018, 6-year-old Sophia began saying things like, "When I lived in London," or "back when I was Margaret." Her parents would smile and play along, thinking she was just being creative. But then Sophia started, providing details that were far too specific, far too historical for a 6-year-old to know. She talked about air raid sirens, about running to bomb shelters in the middle of the night, about the constant fear of German bombers overhead. She described ration books, blackout curtains, and the sound of anti-aircraft guns firing into the night sky. When her parents asked where she learned about World War II, Sophia looked at them confused and said, "I didn't learn it, I remember it." Now here's where it gets absolutely insane. Sophia began describing something that made absolutely no sense in the context of the 1940s. She said that Margaret, the woman she claimed to have been, had visions of the future. Sophia described Margaret sitting in her small London flat in 1943, writing in her diary about seeing images in her mind, images of things that hadn't happened yet. Think about this for a moment. A 6-year-old child in 2018 is describing a woman from 1943 who was having premonitions about the future. This isn't just reincarnation. This is something far more complex and deeply unsettling. Sophia said that Margaret saw impossible birds flying in the sky without any pilots inside them. She described Margaret writing about machines that could show moving pictures of people who weren't there, and rooms where people could talk to others on the other side of the world without telephones. Margaret saw a world where information traveled through invisible waves in the air, where people carried small devices that could answer any question instantly. Linda Chen, Sophia's mother, was disturbed enough by these statements that she began recording them and researching whether anyone named Margaret Halloway had actually lived in London during World War II. What she discovered made her blood run cold. There had indeed been a woman named Margaret Halloway, born in 1922, who lived in East London during the war, and Margaret had died on February 3, 1944, when a V-2 rocket hit her apartment building. But wait, there's more. Linda found references to Margaret in historical archives at the Imperial War Museum. Margaret had worked as a clerk for the Ministry of Information and had kept a diary, portions of which had been donated to the museum by a distant relative in 1987. When Linda obtained copies of the diary entries, she felt chills run down her spine. Margaret's diary contained exactly what Sophia had described. Entries from October 1943 where Margaret wrote about having strange visions, seeing things that didn't exist. She wrote about flying machines with no men inside, hovering like metal birds. She described seeing a great wall of concrete that divided a city, and then falling down as people celebrated. She wrote about boxes that showed moving pictures of the entire world, and invisible waves that carried voices and images through the air. At the time, these diary entries had been dismissed by historians as the anxious fantasies of a young woman living through the trauma of war. Some thought she might have been describing dreams or hallucinations brought on by stress, but Sophia was describing these exact same visions, and she was describing them from Margaret's perspective, as if she had been there, experiencing them. But here's the part that sent chills through everyone involved. Sophia told her parents that Margaret had kept a second diary, a more personal one that she hid because she was afraid people would think she was insane. Sophia said Margaret hid it behind a loose brick in the wall of her bedroom on the 3rd floor behind where her bed used to be. Linda contacted Dr. Patricia Hammond, a historian specializing in World War II civilian life, and shared Sophia's claims. Dr. Hammond was skeptical but intrigued. She managed to identify the building where Margaret Holloway had lived. Miraculously, the building had survived the war, though Margaret herself had died when a different building nearby was hit. In 2019, Dr. Hammond obtained permission to examine the apartment where Margaret had lived, and behind a loose brick in what had been Margaret's bedroom, they found it, a small leather-bound diary wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The diary had been hidden there for 75 years. When they opened it and began reading, the hair on everyone's arms stood on end. Margaret had written extensively about her visions of the future. She described seeing a child, a little girl, who would be born many years after the war. She wrote, "I see her clearly. She has dark hair and kind eyes, and she lives in a place across the ocean. Somehow, I know she will remember me. I don't understand how this is possible, but I feel connected to her across time." Pretty insane, right? But the most disturbing entries came near the end, just weeks before Margaret died. She wrote, "I had the strangest experience today. I felt as though I was looking through someone else's eyes, living in a time far beyond my own. I saw machines that think, cars that drive themselves, and people staring at glowing rectangles in their hands. I saw the Berlin Wall fall, just as I'd envisioned. I saw wars end and new ones begin. And I saw her again, the little girl. She was looking back at me, across the decades. For a moment, I think we saw each other. Two souls separated by time, somehow connected." Sophia, when shown a photograph of Margaret Holloway, began to cry. She said, "That's me. I remember her face. We were the same person, but in different times." Skeptics have argued that this must be an elaborate hoax, that perhaps Sophia's parents planted the diary or fed her information. But Dr. Hammond confirmed that the diary's paper, ink, and handwriting were all consistent with 1940s origin. The hiding place had been sealed behind plaster. That was verified to be from the original construction. There was no way the diary could have been planted recently. Others suggested that perhaps Sophia had psychic abilities and was reading information from the past. But that doesn't explain why Margaret was having visions of the future, visions that included drones, the internet, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, all of which came true decades after her death. So, what's really going on here? Is this evidence that time isn't linear at all, but circular? Could Sophia and Margaret be the same consciousness existing at two different points in time simultaneously? Was Margaret receiving memories from Sophia's future, while Sophia was receiving memories from Margaret's past? And if that's possible, does that mean that past, present, and future are all happening at once, and we're just experiencing them in a specific sequence because of the limitations of our perception? Think about the implications. If Margaret in 1943 could see Sophia's life in 2018, and if Sophia can remember Margaret's life in the 1940s, then consciousness isn't bound by time at all. It exists outside of time, experiencing all moments simultaneously. We might all be living infinite lives across infinite timelines. And death isn't an ending, it's just a shift in perspective from one timeline to another. Extremely fascinating and absolutely terrifying. Because if this is true, then everything we think we know about causality, about the flow of time from past to present to future, is completely wrong. Time might not be a river flowing in one direction. It might be an ocean where past and future exist together, where we can move backward and forward, where our consciousness can inhabit multiple moments at once. And if that's the case, then who are we really? Are we the person we are right now in this moment? Or are we the sum of all the lives we've lived and will live across all of time? A thought. That is as mind-bending as it is impossible to fully comprehend. So, there you have it. 10 cases that challenge everything we think we know about reincarnation, time, and the nature of consciousness itself. From a 3-year-old speaking ancient Coptic, to a woman drawing blueprints of undiscovered Roman buildings, from a boy predicting his own assassination from a past life, to a child who remembered future events before they happened, these cases force us to ask some absolutely mind-bending questions. What if reincarnation isn't about souls being reborn at all? What if it's actually consciousness traveling through time, accessing different points in history, different lives, different timelines? And if that's true, then time isn't the linear progression we've always believed it to be. Past, present, and future might all exist simultaneously. And some people, for reasons we don't understand, can tap into these other moments in time. Now we're really curious to hear what you think. Do you believe consciousness can travel through time? Which of these 10 cases fascinated you the most? Was it the boy who spoke ancient Coptic, the Tibetan monk who knew how Stonehenge was built, or the girl who remembered both the past and the future? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and we absolutely love hearing your theories. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into the mysteries that science can't explain. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, the next time you have a strange memory or a vivid dream about a place you've never been, maybe it's not just your imagination, maybe it's a glimpse into another time. Pretty creepy, right?